Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Ramblick. Thank you for joining me for this particular podcast. Before we dive into the topic today, I just thought I'd do a little bit of self-promotion. My new book, Crown, Playing in the Shadows, is out. It's on Crown Casino. You can find it at wilkinsonpublishing.com.au and a range of other online bookstores and bricks and mortar stores as well. Now on to business. The recent closure of or the end of the prosecution of Bernard Colleary, a lawyer representing witness K, in a court case related to issues that the Australian government itself caused when it sought to bug, and indeed did bug, the headquarters of the government and Timor. There are a string of matters that need to be discussed here because it relates to the behaviours of government with allies and overseas friends. It relates to how people deal with whistleblowers and also how we maintain a level of decency with countries in the region, and also how we reform government practices and over time. Now, joining me today is someone who knows a lot about government. He's rather outspoken on Twitter. He's got a deep experience in organisational behaviour and how to change things. A gentleman by the name of Steve Davies, and Steve's got an interesting perspective on all of this with a lifetime of experience in the public service. Steve, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure, Tom.
Now, before we dive into a raft of other topics, which I know we will, a springboard for our discussion today is really the winding back of the prosecution of Bernard Colleary. It received a lot of media coverage for understandable reasons, but you've seen government departments close up and government behaviour close up. How significant is this pullback of the prosecution by Mark Dreyfus, the Attorney-General?
Yeah, it's hugely significant, Tom. To pull back from something that the government has expended so much effort on, a great cost to taxpayers, is massively significant because sitting behind all that is an entire system of what we do to whistleblowers, and that ranges from, well, I'll start at the apex of it. Ultimately it means that we'll come after you with the full legal resources of the Commonwealth, right? And money's no object, through to where people make disclosures internally and promptly get attacked, undermined, discredited via things like the human resource function, via the APS code of conduct if they're public servants and so on. And that's the point. There's an entire system behind this. It's operated like clockwork for decades, and now on this particular case they go, no, that's it, end of story. The thing is, it's not the end of the story, it's the beginning of the story about what needs to be done to change that system and what drives it, what drives the abuse of legal and administrative power.
Let me take that point up because someone and then the listeners should be aware of this. Steve and I have spoken on quite a few occasions on a range of issues to organisational behaviour and the philosophy of it. There is a danger, isn't there, with the discontinuation of the Colleary prosecution, that people will see it as a closure of a matter and very rapidly forget the significance of why it occurred and why it's had to be discontinued. which points to something that Gordon Allport wrote many decades ago, in fact, in the early part of last century, related to the philosophy of the newspapers and how the media seeks closure and to move on to stuff because the audiences can't cope with things being unresolved.
No, there is a danger in that, and in part that's due to the way the law works. So the law works on precedent. So there's case number 1, case number 2, case number 3. So, for example, we've got Bernard Colleary, we've got Richard Boyle from the ATO, there's David McBride, and numerous others, right? And the pattern is the same time after time, which is to attack people and shut them down, and as part of that, discredit them, etc. So it would be similar stuff happens to members of the public who persist with complaints against government agencies, right? So the story's not over, particularly when you think that, I mean, I hate the term whistleblowing, okay? When people make disclosures concerning bad behaviour and practices in government and the public service, what they're telling you is things are not well, things are broken. Now, you would think, because imagine if Apple Computer or whoever behaved like this, you'd think you'd look at something calmly and objectively. You wouldn't get the knives out at the drop of a hat. And then you'd say, this is valuable. This is information we need to know. We've got a problem. Yeah, we'll fix it. Right? The problem we've got is this is a long-lived culture in both politics and the public service, right? To shut things down and get them off the books. The result of that is that problems fester and grow. And that's the interesting thing about Richard Boyle's whistleblowing, because Richard and I have spoken extensively. And it's the same deal. You raise an issue, raise a problem, it's seen as a threat, and therefore it has to be dealt with. That means the individual who's spoken out has to be dealt with. So, and that colours the way that the whole system operates. So, for example, when Christian Porter was Attorney-General, right, I forget which, it was I forget which politician it was, but there was a Senate inquiry into the operation of the model litigant obligations. There, as it were, they are the rules that say just because government's got a pile of money, they will not throw millions of dollars to deal with someone legally when the problem is, fairly small, etc. Yet they do that. That's how they get away with the amount of financial effort they put into dealing with David McBride, Richard Boyle, Bernard Colleary. All right. So on paper the rules say they can't do it, but they're not enforceable, right? When that review was done, it was a Senate inquiry. You had a bucket of submissions from legal firms and community-facing legal firms and other entities. Their submissions all said, "Yeah, it's broken. We've got to solve this. Those rules need to be enforceable." Right? It is very telling that, for example, the Attorney-General's Department, the Australian Taxation Office, Human Services, and others, but I'll limit it to those three for this conversation, all said, no, there's nothing to see here, it's fine, nothing needs to change. Right? Everybody else says it is broken because you've got a rule that's unenforceable, so you can continue to throw money at a case to win at all costs.
It is It's an interesting issue here that it plays out. When you look at all three cases that have been talked about in the public domain, if we take Colleary particularly, given that one's now been resolved, how much do you think, or how great a role do you think, the ego of the administration plays a part in its decision to keep wanting to belt the crap out of somebody?
Oh, it's hard to tell in terms of expressing whether it's down to one person's ego. So I want to add something to that. We know politicians don't like to lose, right? I've run this up the flagpole. We're going after someone. We've spent this amount of money. Once you go down that path, we've got to win, right?
So it's about victory. Victory equals making sure you save face, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it's also to send a signal that to everybody else to shut up, other this will happen to you, right? And that's the common goss in the public service. Don't speak up, otherwise you'll get your head chopped off.
Right. So what we have is a situation where governments are afraid to lose space in the public domain by.
Yep. And then what runs through their risk-averse minds is that, oh well, if we suddenly start, yes, we've dealt with the Bernard Colleary matter. There's the other matters. With the other individuals I mentioned, we can't let that. We can't go too far with it, because then everyone will think they can get away with speaking out. All right. Now, their retort to that will be, well, we've got an act that protects whistleblowers. No, we don't have an act that actually protects whistleblowers. What we've got is a system that is gamed by agencies. The current act is not worth the paper it's written on.
We've mentioned the legislation in place now. You've said that it's not adequate when it comes to protecting whistleblowers. What, in your words, are the weaknesses that legislation has?
I think the big weakness, the underlying one, is that whistleblowing is seen as the exception rather than the rule. And there's a lot of wriggle room for, well, you're doing a number of things. You're giving people an identity as a whistleblower. So they create a them-us situation from the very beginning. It's no accident that certainly in the public service, people who make disclosures suddenly find themselves subjected to being more closely managed by human resources, for example.
Is this in the context of being performance managed out of the organisation?
In practice, and I've experienced it myself, what they do is try and bestow a troubled identity on people, right? Once you bestow an identity, so you go troublemaker, whistleblower, troubled identity, you can't trust what they say.
Isn't there something else that also comes into play? In a collegiate environment like a government department or a government agency, you mentioned the notion of whistleblower, troublemaker, but then there's also not a team player.
That does enter into it, and this is where there's a simple level to this, right? When you have a look at all the functions that come into play to deal with people who raise inconvenient truths or question. It's all your corporate functions, human resources, communications, etc. And they're pretty constant right across the public service. So it's all of those functions that kick in. So that is predictable. That in turn, I mean, people will then go, oh, so-and-so's being closely as much as they don't mention it, people cotton on and people learn to shut up. They see what happens to others. Right? And the more or less complicated, well, not really complicated, the human element of that revolves around the culture that it not only reflects the culture, it shapes the culture as well. And it's a culture of silence. And it's about censoring the conversation rather than dealing with substantive issues. So, for example, right, something that might be, yes, it's a serious problem, but it's small. By putting people through the meat grinder, right, the problem grows, doesn't go away. And that's why we're at the point now where here we are in 2022 and we're hearing we need a National Integrity Commission. Should have been done decades ago.
It's an interesting question when we come to talking about an anti-corruption or an integrity commission. Because a question does arise, doesn't it? As to whether there's scope for enhancing, for example, the resources and capability and funding of a body like the ANAO. Because the work that the ANAO does is done in accordance with a far-reaching act. Anybody that fails to cooperate with the ANAO in terms of the provision of documentation can find themselves in court. And the ANAO's reports are, by their very nature, independent. So there's it's unlike a parliamentary committee that can come up with a majority view and then a minor sort of a dissenting opinion to the majority from those people who don't like what's been said or what's been found or what recommendations are being made. To what extent is this a discussion that needs to be broadened about properly funding existing accountability mechanisms, but also creating an integrity commission? But right now, well, I'm hearing a lot of people talk about an ICAC, certainly on social media, where the refrain is you need one. That's adding, or rather renovating the system, adding a room to the system. My question is whether the other bits of the room also need to be, strengthened and had some cladding and whatever else put up.
Absolutely. The way I look at it is this. You look at the way ICACs are framed around the country, and a National Integrity Commission is just an ICAC under another name. They all have a very strong legal component, right? And that's the lens through which typically they look at it. Beefing up the ANAO, which you could look at the ANAO as essentially being a powerful research arm, right?
Yep.
So logically, you'd want that to feed into it as well. So yeah, there's a lot of grunt to be gained by harnessing the expertise of outfits like the ANAO to do that chunk of the function. I think we need to look at this. If you just talk about this as an integrity function, yes, you want an ICAC type thing. Yes, you want a research component. And definitely, yes, you need an education component, right? The education component would need to function on behaviours and practices, so we can forget about the waffle about talking about culture, because what underpins culture is the behaviour and practices that we see, particularly, especially in relation to how organisations, government departments and politicians manage situations where they're being told something's broken and boy, oh boy, I've got bad news for you. And that's what whistleblowers do. And they're targeted for doing so. They should be regarded as an asset.
Right. I guess introducing something new but building up existing functions is where your mind's at the moment in terms of improving what people do now.
Yeah.
But also ensuring there's another body in place to do what people out there would like to see done in more detail.
Because the problem we've got is there's a wealth of information. I mean, people need to ask themselves, how many culture surveys have we had across the APS? How much stuff have they been looking at whether people comply with X, Y, Z? It's gone on and on and on for decades, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet here we are again with problems persisting. Given my background in organisational development, I put that down to, outfits like the Public Service Commission will talk about culture and measure culture till the cows come home, but what's it achieved? Nothing. All right.
I mean, you haven't seen the cows come back through the gate yet, have you?
No. Whereas if we hone in on behaviour and practices in an organisation, which is where Albert Bandura's work comes in, then you can be far more precise about what are the set of behaviours and practices, the indications of those that actually tell you things are not well. Beforehand, prevention's better than cure.
Now, there is something else you mentioned in terms of education that I wanted to expand upon before we sort of move into a couple of final observations. Education can take several forms when it comes to issues of ethics, corruption, integrity. Now, one of them is the setting of appropriate examples in the workplace and rewarding behaviour that is organisation building, rather than rewarding behaviour that is designed to keep mistakes hidden and unrepaired. But the other thing that's equally critical is the role of continuing education outside of a department. To what extent do you think universities have a role to play in the provision of a theoretical base for the identification of and the dealing with corruption in the public sector?
Absolutely essential in my view. After all, a lot of public servants, people who wish to be public servants go through our university, through our tertiary system of education. Absolutely crucial, because to a lot of people, to the bloke in the street, to someone who's new, fresh out of university, it becomes it's a mysterious black box. That there's because one of the reasons for that is so that you go, oh, I just got to fit in here and it'll be all right. But unless you've got a solid lens, set of glasses through which to critically look at and understand what you're seeing, then all that happens is you'll get some people who will say, well, I've been here for X period of time, I don't like it, I'll piss off, right? You get others who go, oh, that's the way things really work around here, I'll shut up and just do my job. And to give people a concrete example of what that translates as for Australians on the ground, look no further than the robo-debt exercise, right? Massive use of data on people on an industrial scale, and people died, right? So all the way along the line, there would have been the politicians involved, of course, who said, we're going to do this. Then all along the line, there will be public servants who worked on that, right? And where were the voices of dissent about doing something with data and technology on an industrial scale that in a way that completely lost sight of the population they were dealing with, that resulted in death, right? And that's what happens if you have a closed system that basically says shut up and follow your orders. You know, Nazi Germany did the same, by the way. Then harm is caused, and then what you've done is created a situation where, you know, one person might bob up, the whistleblower, and say, hey, this is broken, this is wrong, here's the negative consequences, people will die. No, it should have been spoken about all the way through, and that way you prevent bad things being done.
You've seen the public service in action over the years. We come back to that issue of education and building a bit of a moral basis or an ethical basis.
Yeah.
Is this something that needs to happen? And I mentioned the use of graduate certificates by universities as the smaller qualifications in this context. Is this something that needs to happen when somebody joins the public service early? Then they start doing a particular program of training, so that once they complete that and then get practice under their belt at the same time, you're building a person. You've got a person that's able to make better decisions on the ground.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. Mainly because it's, you know, there is a tendency to go, okay, it's a straightforward technical thing, tick the boxes, and then you follow the process. Delving into the impact of an initiative on people is more complex. So you need a set of reliable glasses, which is why we should pick up work like Albert Bandura's, translate that into very clear training courses for the new employee through to the management all the way. You can't just go, chop, they've done a course and that's it. This requires maintenance because it would represent a significant cultural shift.
Yeah, a course is a springboard into rather than a completion of a discipline.
Yeah.
Just for listeners, before we sort of wrap things up, Albert Bandura is a renowned, I guess you'd say, sociologist and philosopher who's looked at the issue of moral disengagement and how various organisations fail when they become, in effect, machines.
Yeah.
And don't apply what we would generally call a moral judgment when they're operating on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
Now, Steve, we've actually covered a lot of ground in the time we've spoken, and we should do it again at some point. But if people are interested in touching base with you, what is the best way for them to connect?
Well, my public email address is steve8davies@gmail.com. So if people want to flick me an email, then we can take it from there and communicate by another means. My Twitter handle is @Osloop.
So you can find Steve online. Twitter is probably the easiest way to find him, at Osloop, and you'll see his contributions to public discourse on a range of topics, and accompanied by at times colourful reactions from some of the people with which he engages. It's an absolute blast to have a look at. Steve, thank you so much for joining me for this podcast. We should do it again.
We might have to, who knows?
I've been talking to Steve Davies, a retired public servant, but also someone who's had enormous experience in information technology development as well as organisational behaviour. And we'll be back reasonably soon with another podcast.